Self-overcoming is one of my favorite passages in the book. It's central to Zarathustra, and by extension, Nietzsche's philosophy. I've divided this passage into 3 main sections or takeaways, and I'll go through them one by one. This passage is a rare, direct insight into Nietzsche's metaphysics. Most traditional philosophers just give us an entire book delineating their take on the underlying nature of reality, but Nietzsche leaves it to us to piece together the fragments. The ignorant, to be sure, the people, they are like a river on which a boat floats along, and in the boat sit the estimates of value, solemn and disguised. Your will and your valuations have you put on the river of becoming? It betrays to me an old will to power, what is believed by the people to be good and evil. He is a notorious adversary of systems thinking or system building, and so instead opts to give us just flashes of insight. Now, in philosophy, there are entire schools of thought that believe that reality is composed of stable, enduring entities. Zarathustra insists, however, that nothing is fixed, everything is in flux, in an eternal process of becoming, the river of becoming, as he puts it. What registers to us as people, objects, etc., are just clusters of matter momentarily grouped together. Our perception is simply not sensitive or refined enough to the delicate changes that are quote-unquote actually happening. I'm going to digress here to illustrate how significant this is using the example of an apple. But just for context, this is picked out from one of Nietzsche's most renowned works called The Gay Science, in a passage entitled The Origin of the Logical. What is the origin of logic in man's head? Surely it arose out of the illogical, the realm of which must originally have been immense. But innumerable beings drew inferences in a way different from that in which we do now, and perished. Nonetheless, they might have been closer to the truth. He, for instance, who did not know how to find identity often enough, both with regard to nourishment and to hostile animals. That is, he who subsumed too slowly and was too cautious in subsumption, had a slighter probability of survival than he who, in all cases of similarity, immediately guessed that they were identical. The predominant disposition, however, to treat the similar as identical, an illogical disposition, for there is nothing identical as such, is what first supplied all the foundations for logic. Similarly, in order for the concept of substance to originate, which is indispensable to logic, though nothing real corresponds to it in the strictest sense, it was necessary that for a long time changes in things not be seen, not be perceived. The beings who did not see things exactly had a head start over those who saw everything, quote-unquote, in a flux. Now, picture yourself as a hungry forager in the ancient world. You stumble upon this bright red, sweet-tasting thing hanging from a tree. You eat it, it fuels you, you live another day. But then tomorrow, you encounter a different red, sweet-tasting thing that looks almost the same, but not quite. If you fail to recognize that this is the same kind of thing as yesterday's, and if you don't form the concept of apple in your mind, you're pretty finished. You starve all because you treated each object as entirely unique. The point is that there are innumerable differences from apple to apple. It just doesn't help to act as if those differences exist, and positing the fiction of the existence of the apple is highly expedient to us. Now, back to the river of becoming. For Nietzsche, all of being is simply an abstraction out of becoming, and necessarily so. How else would we navigate the world? How else would we play the role of an agent in a world that is an arena? As a side note, this is not an original thought by any means. The river of becoming idea likely comes from Heraclitus, a notable pre-Socratic thinker that many of you will also be familiar with. And he says, "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man." So, despite ordinarily his devastating originality, Nietzsche in this case seems to be a descendant of a school of thought we could call a process ontology. This subsection to me feels like the build-up to the climax of this passage. Nietzsche reckons that all living things are caught in this cosmic game of commanding and obeying. And it's worth noting that when Nietzsche makes these claims, he's being quite piercing, so there's no facet of reality in his mind that escapes his assertions and isn't subject to what he's saying. But wherever I found living things, there heard I also the language of obedience. All living things are obeying things. And this heard I secondly, whatever cannot obey itself is commanded. Such is the nature of living things. This, however, is the third thing which I heard, namely, that commanding is more difficult than obeying, and not only because the commander beareth the burden of all obeyers, and because this burden readily crusheth him. So, kind of self-explanatory, but one thing I remember being taken aback by when I first studied this book was Nietzsche's insistence that commanding is more difficult than obeying, which it certainly is. As a commander, it can be crushing to bear the weight of all the obeyers. There's a collective consequence to your actions, and to withstand that requires more robustness internally than being an obeyer. Now, before your mind goes to every US president ever as a shining example of a counter-argument, it's worth remembering what most people know already in 2025, that those guys really aren't pulling any strings whatsoever. But because this video isn't focused on various industrial complexes, back to commanding and obeying. There is a free-falling, ecstatic Dionysian element in surrendering and being told what to do. Having guardrails, the infinite reduced to the intelligible finite in front of you so you don't risk combinatorial explosion. Obeying is easy. We do it all day, every day, arguably without choice. But commanding, in any capacity, is most fundamentally a gamble. It's insecure and always likely to collapse. Maybe that's why we revere so ardently the few successes we've seen throughout history. Okay, side note, Nietzsche does not talk about master and slave dynamics the way Hegel and Marx do. I'm going to do a separate video on that, whether there is interest or not. But the last thing I wanted to highlight in this area was this line. And where there is sacrifice and service and love glances, there also is the will to be master. By byways doth the weaker then slink into the fortress, and into the heart of the mightier one, and there stealeth power. So throughout Thus Spoke Zarathustra, using Zarathustra as a mouthpiece for his philosophy, Nietzsche is adamant in postulating that even the most seemingly benign, harmless, and even magnanimous acts of virtue, when done by weaker people, they have a hidden will to power and a dominance lurking behind them. So the downtrodden person attempts to slink into the fortress and steal power by byways. They can't do it on their own through brute force alone because look at them. They are pathetic. So they create elaborate edifices to level the natural differences that exist between people in aptitude, all-round competence, and strength. And you might even call one of these edifices equality. Now, in his other renowned work, The Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche presents an essay describing the priestly inversion of values and the hidden agenda of, in this case, Christianity, allowing for the gradual theft of power. The revolt of the slaves in morals begins in the very principle of resentment becoming creative and giving birth to values, a resentment experienced by creatures who, deprived as they are of the proper outlet of action, are forced to find their compensation in an imaginary revenge. Think about how many times you've been out-alphaed in real life, and then you go home that day, later that night you have a shower and you fantasize about the things you could have said, convince yourself you did say them, you did hurt them, you did strike that blow, and then you go to sleep peacefully. So here Zarathustra refutes and challenges common takes on the fundamental motive or drives inherent in life itself. A lot of these ideas were gaining hold and prevalence during the time of his writing, and I would argue are even stronger today. So he personifies life, turning her into a character who finally reveals her secrets to him. And this secret spake life herself unto me. Behold, said she, I am that which must ever surpass itself. Okay, so think of the way meditation and other age-old practices are marketed to us. Not always, but usually the goal is something like stillness, the end of desire, the end of striving. You're supposed to quiet the ego. But for Nietzsche, this is precisely the problem. That kind of spirituality is just a dressed up version of the old ascetic ideal rearing its ugly head. It doesn't honor the intoxication of risk, creation, and conquest. It just wants to negate itself. So Zarathustra returns here in this part of the book, claiming that he learnt from the horse's mouth itself that life isn't about achieving stillness, it's about overcoming what it was, to surpass what it was yesterday. To long for peace, quiet, tranquility, equanimity, or stillness is to long for decline. It's decadent. So shifting gears a little, earlier in the book, in the passage entitled The Dance Song, life mocks Zarathustra for trying to comprehend her existence. She derisively laughs off the idea that she is some unfathomable riddle, saying, "Such is the language of all fish. What they do not fathom is unfathomable." Here, however, we reach some sort of a resolution. Life is not a fixed thing to be understood, a final boss in a video game to defeat so you can clock the game and walk off into the sunset. Right? That's just an early grave. Or as Nietzsche would say, talk about the last man. So this may be a bit of a reach, and I'm unsure about this, but he may be using the word fish here to speak in a derogatory way about Christianity. The fish is one of the oldest known symbols of Christ, and I know Carl Jung does speak at great length about the advent of Christianity and its symbolic significance, also its concordance with the age of Pisces. So if synchronicities between human behavior and cosmic regularities appeals to you, there's a really cool section in Ion about this that you can look into as well. But the other insight that's possibly a reach is that fish are the classic symbol of the unwitting prisoner. They don't know that they're in water because they haven't experienced unwater because they can't. But interestingly and similarly, in the history of thought, for Nietzsche, the majority of thinkers have conflated their own limits with the limits of reality and knowledge itself. But going back to that line, "And this secret spake life herself unto me. Behold," said she, "I am that which must ever surpass itself." So Nietzsche here opposes contemporary rising sentiments that organisms are driven by self-preservation. His answer to that is, "He certainly did not hit the truth who shot at it the formula, will to existence. That will doth not exist. For what is not, cannot will. That, however, which is in existence, how could it still strive for existence? Only where there is life is there also will. Not, however, will to life, but, so teach I thee, will to power." So how far does Nietzsche want to take this? Does this mean that everything you love must one day be overcome too? There is no such thing as unchanging, unconditional love. Everything you create, you must one day be adverse to as well. Like, share, subscribe.